Good morning, all. Thank you for coming. I know it wasn't easy. And want to welcome you to the January 2011 Broadband Breakfast Club. And broadbandbreakfast.com is pleased to present the Broadband Breakfast Club with the support of our sponsors. Today's event is moderated by Adam Bender. He's Associate Editor at Communications Daily. Adam writes about national policies for cell phones, television, and the internet. Since joining the newsletter in 2007, Adam has covered Congress, the FCC, federal courts, and several major telecom industry conferences. He's won awards from the Society of Professional Journalists and the Specialized Information Publishers Association. Adam graduated from American University in May 2007 with a degree in print journalism. And one more thing before our program starts. On your table, underneath the program, is a survey. We really appreciate your feedback. So if you could fill out the survey before you leave, we'd be greatly appreciative. And thank you again for coming. And I'll take it to Adam. Adam.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming out to the Broadband Breakfast. We have a new Congress, and so we're going to be asking today, what are the chances of a rewrite of the Telecom Act, and what other issues will be priorities for the new Congress. As you know, in 1996, the Telecom Act was the first major overhaul of telecom laws since 1934. The emphasis of the act was on creating competition, which was a shift from the natural monopoly that had been envisioned by the original act. Since '96, there have been several efforts to update the act to reflect advancing technology and the growing importance of the internet. One such effort happened in 2006, but which we may talk about, that failed to get off the ground. Tech issues, of course, have become increasingly important, especially since the election of President Obama, who's emphasized those issues. The recent Comcast court ruling, of course, is a major reason for the current push, because it raised the question of how much authority the FCC actually has over the internet. And last summer, the House and Senate Commerce Committees started work. They held a series of workshops to consider how they might update the act. But we haven't seen anything come of that yet, but it's a new Congress. So first I just want to start out by introducing our panelists. Walter McCormick is the President and CEO of US Telecom. Before joining US Telecom, he was president of the American Trucking Association, and he was the general counsel of the US Transportation Department and general counsel of the Senate Commerce Committee. Next to him is Shirley Bloomfield of NTCA, which is the trade group representing small, rural-based telcos. She started her career as a staff aide to Congressman David Obey, and later was a congressional aide on the House Budget Committee. And she was a lobbyist for NTCA from 1986 to 2007, and she's also worked for Qwest and Verizon. Next to her, we have Jerry James. He's the CEO of CompTel, which represents the competitive local exchange carriers. He was the co-founder of telecommunications consulting firm, the Warner Whitney Group, and he was also the co-founder and president of Grande Communications. And finally, we have Tom McMahon, who's a last-minute stand-in here for our original panelist, Fred Campbell, who was regrettably unable to make it through the terrible ice today. Tom does federal relations for Qwest, and he has long experience on the Hill. He worked there for 10 years. So just to start out, before we get into whether it's likely there's going to be a rewrite of the Telecom Act, I first just want to get your opinion, your association's opinions on whether there should be a rewrite of the Telecom Act. So let's just we'll go down. Start with Walter.
Well, Adam, thank you very much for having me. Sylvia, thank you for having me. I wanted to be here this morning to to demonstrate that neither rain nor snow nor sleet nor hail will stop us from calling for an update in the nation's communications laws. So yes, we strongly support an update. And here's why. The 1996 Act was not about broadband. The 1996 Act was primarily driven by a desire to inject new competition into the voice telephony market at the local level. And the idea was that there were basically 3 dominant long-distance carriers. There were dominant voice providers in each market. The idea was maybe the long-distance carriers will get in the local market, the local guys get in the long-distance market, and we'll have more competition. And so the Act has a series of titles. It deals with multi-channel video providers. Broadband is a multi-channel video provider. It deals with one-to-one communications, voice communications. Broadband now offers voice communications. It dealt with broadcasting. And we have a situation now where broadband is broadcasting. And with regard to consumer choice, we have a situation where the FCC now says that 95% of Americans subscribe to broadband, that 4 out of 5 Americans have a choice between 2 fixed-line broadband providers. And we have a situation where consumer expectations in this market, the chairman of the FCC himself has said, my authority is unclear to deliver on consumer expectations in this market. We have 300 members of Congress who are saying it's the purview of the Congress to determine policy in this area. So when you look at the consumer issues of today, issues regarding behavioral advertising, issues regarding blocking or impairing or degrading access to certain websites, when you look at issues of privacy, the FCC only has authority over certain platform providers. It does not have clear authority over the entire internet economy in a way that can provide consumers with common expectations about their internet experience. So we think that the law needs to be updated.
Sometimes in Washington it becomes the art of the possible. And so I would say that our perspective is off the top, the FCC actually does have a lot of authority right now to deal with a lot of the issues that we have out there. It's really a question of whether or not they're actually taking some of that authority and actually making some of those decisions. I think partly, too, for those, I know a number of faces in this room have been around during the 96 Act, which started in the 80s and was a long, tortured process. It's so difficult to get anything done. So I think, as Walter kind of talked about, some of the issues that need to be dealt with, I think there is a sense of what can Congress really accomplish, what can be done, what needs to be done. We look at things like the legislation Congressman Terry had out there last year. It was an amazing thing to be able to get as much consensus as they were able to get around the table on some of the key issues to move forward on. And I think that we look at something like that and say, that's a good place to start. I also think, some of these things have to be almost rifle shot in terms of actually trying to accomplish something. So I guess we would say there's a couple of things. The FCC probably does have a fair amount of authority. It's a question whether or not they choose to exercise it. And then the question being, what can you actually accomplish in this Congress?
Comtel represents the competitive sector of the industry. We're celebrating our 30th anniversary this year, so we're glad to still be around. And as our members, who largely at the very beginning were long-distance companies, have evolved to become very complex communications providers that provide both local, long-distance, broadband, internet, private networks, and a whole host of other things, managed services, cloud computing, and so on. So has the 96 Act evolved. There's a lot of settled law out there, a lot of cases. We are an industry, much like others, that litigate when we don't like the answer. So we have a lot of decisions and a lot of support from the FCC, and I agree with Shirley that we need to keep working with the FCC to see if they can solve the answers and be enforcement of the 96 Act. But there are some particular topics that need to be considered and can be considered in isolation, meaning on a single topic. I believe this Congress does not want to take up an omnibus bill that's thousands of pages, and as a result, we can't look to that. I was part of that entourage that led to the 96 Act. It took forever to get that consensus and to get that bill done. Our industry is always evolving, and we will find a way and find a solution. That's what innovators do. That's what entrepreneurs do. And I believe this industry has proven it can do that.
Hi, I'm Tom McMahon with Quest, and I'm
trust everyone's cell phones are working this morning thanks to the Quest network and other network providers, that no matter what the weather, we're here to serve all of you. So I'm glad that that's working this morning. I agree with Jerry. I don't think that Congress is ready to take on an omnibus piece of legislation. However, Chairman Upton has talked about another big piece of legislation, that is health care, and how he plans to take a look at that and make some tweaks and some changes to the health care law. So I think that perhaps Chairman Upton and the rest of the House Commerce Committee, Energy and Commerce Committee, may do the same with some telecommunications and communications laws. I think it's also going to be interesting to see what Congress will be working with the FCC on the National Broadband Plan. There's lots of issues in the National Broadband Plan that we're interested in, as well as other network carriers, things like intercarrier compensation and USF and other programs like that. So I think it'd be interesting just to see how Congress and the FCC plan to work together on the National Broadband Plan and how that might play into any changes that might take the place of an omnibus piece of legislation.
Okay. Well, I hear two of you saying that it's unlikely to have a comprehensive rewrite. Is this something that you see could be done in pieces, just from each of your association's perspectives?
Yeah, I don't think that people want to undertake a full rewrite of the 1996 Act. But I do think that there is a need and an interest in updating the laws. That was really the approach that was taken in 2006. I mean, it was never intended to be a full rewrite of the 1996 Act. But in terms of updating the laws, we came pretty close. I mean, legislation passed the House of Representatives. Legislation passed the Senate Commerce Committee. We were in a position, had legislation passed on the Senate floor, we would have gone to conference. The only reason the legislation was not taken up on the Senate floor was that in 2006, the net neutrality issue raised its head. And after the Senate Commerce Committee voted the bill out of committee, there was a hold placed on it, and those who did not want to see legislation move without new net neutrality regulation threatened to filibuster. And those who did not want the legislation to pass with new net neutrality legislation threatened to filibuster. And so you had a stalemate, because there could not get 2/3 of the Senate, supermajority of the Senate, 60 votes in the Senate, for one position or the other. But that's pretty remarkable.
Given neutrality remains to be kind of a major focus, is it possible that the same kind of thing could happen again?
I think, well, obviously anything's always possible. I mean, when you have to get 60 votes to get through the Senate. But I think that late last year with Henry Waxman's proposed compromise, you saw a lot of support for that. And so I think that there is common ground to be had on the net neutrality issue. I think that the thornier issues at this point are going to be the behavioral advertising and the privacy issues, because so many of the enterprises involved in the internet economy, their business plans are basically based upon knowing everything they can know about you. And so that becomes, it's going to become a challenge.
Does anybody else in the panel want to comment on that?
So, when I think about kind of what Congress is going to be tied up with, first of all, you've got the situation politically where we're kind of in a lead up in the 112th Congress to the next presidential election. You've got the committees of jurisdiction dealing with things like healthcare reform and net neutrality, and some of those issues that I think become very hot and very emotional. I think that actually also makes kind of a complete rewrite very burdensome. And the one thing I'll never forget about the 96 Act was, I think it was the Senate Commerce Committee, and maybe it was Chairman Pressler at the time, stood up and he said, we've passed it, we've got a good bill because nobody likes it. And it was kind of that sentiment of, how do you do something where you appease everybody a little bit, but nobody's walking out of the room feeling victorious, for their sector of the industry. And I think with the heat of kind of, again, presidential election and a lot of the other very, very strong emotions that are out there, I think that makes it very tough. And then I think you layer on top of that, looking at somebody like Chairman Rockefeller and Senator Hutchins from Texas, you don't see anything coming out from them about any kind of movement, any kind of interest. So, it then becomes a long ramp up time. So I think all of those kind of indicators really lead to, to Walter's point, are there going to be, is there going to be more focus on privacy? I look at things like cybersecurity. In a lot of ways, that should be such a no-brainer, given kind of our market trends and how our networks have evolved and how they're used, and how cybersecurity couldn't make it through. These things are so much harder and get bogged down so much. Once you start getting into the minutia of it, then you actually kind of see from the surface. And I think a lot of issues, spectrum management, spectrum allocation, those are things that should be easy. So I think those will be some early tests to see how Congress is able to work together to get some of these things through.
Yeah.
I think there's several things that the Congress is going to take a look at, in particular, cybersecurity, obviously privacy, how that balances, and what is the role of the provider versus the content folks, and tracking and consumer issues. Those are going to be things that they've already indicated that they have a long-term interest in. USF and Intercare we share some concern about where that's going to be, and obviously some of those topics are teed up at the FCC under the National Broadband Plan implementation schedule, and we're hopeful that they're going to proceed with that. And when that occurs, I believe Congress is going to say, we have our oversight rule, power, and so we want to take a look at what you're doing, and they're going to give their advice to the agency. So I think we're in a process where certain things may kick off of each other from time to time. As the FCC maybe moves forward to act, then Congress is going to exercise its right to give judgment to it. At the same time, we want to protect the rights of the competitor under the 96 Act. And people have to learn the differences between what rides on top of a network versus what is involved in running a network. Mm-hmm. And we concern ourselves about what are the obligations of the network provider to be able to protect their own consumers from viruses and all kinds of things. At the same time, we want to have the best relationship with our consumer as we possibly can. Obviously, that's what pays the bills. And so we have this concern that sometimes when you start talking about the internet, we throw everything in the bucket, and not everything belongs in the bucket. Sometimes there's separate buckets. There's network issues, then there's content issues, and then there's other protections and safeguards that need to be looked at.
Yeah, you bring up some great points. I mean, it's so complicated because there are so many issues that are at stake here. It's not just taking a look at, just necessarily access or things like that, but taking a look at cybersecurity, as you mentioned, Shirley, and spectrum issues, and all these other things you mentioned. That the National Broadband Plan, I think there are 40 different issues that the FCC will be taking up in the National Broadband Plan over the next 2 years. So there are a lot of things that will be addressed in the National Broadband Plan, and you're right to see what Congress will do in its oversight as the FCC takes on those issues and goes through them. But I think also there's just this general sense on the Hill about broadband in particular providing jobs and how it's contributing to the economy. And I don't think necessarily that there's members of Congress right now want to do anything to inhibit any of that growth that broadband companies and all sorts of companies involved in communications or what they're doing right now to contribute to the economy and provide jobs. So I think that's going to be a key, especially as this Congress takes a look at the economy and what it can do for job growth.
Question for Mr. James. Given the 96 Act was all about competition and setting that up, is there a fear that a rewrite could, I guess, kind of change the rules around that?
Certainly, we think so. We filed positions over at the FCC right now that there are certain large carriers who take the position that they interconnect on an IP managed network basis on a volunteer basis. We don't believe that it's volunteer, that it's a requirement under the 96 Act. And so we believe that the Act is technologically neutral in many aspects of it. And so it has been a far-reaching bill and is still active and alive and can be still used for a number of these types of topics. So what we want to see is if there's legislation or any decisions moving forward, that competition is promoted as a result of that, not diminished in any form.
Does anyone want to respond to that from the incumbent side? Or no?
That
All
I
right,
won.
fair enough.
Then we all agree.
All right.
I like that. Be sure that's recorded.
Yeah, I have a scorecard right here.
Adding to that point, we just completed our, every year we do a broadband survey, and we, obviously we represent 600 small rural carriers in 44 states, so we are the small guys in the areas where historically there wasn't service providers. So it was interesting to me because one of the things that really jumped out in the survey that we released last week is that we now see my folks who provide, virtually all of them provide broadband in their rural communities. Now this year, 90% of them are saying that they actually have competition in terms of some type of broadband service provider in their communities. So that jump has been huge over and incremental over the course of time. So, it's a fact of the markets.
Right. Many of these telecom issues are obviously just complex by their nature, and given the election saw many people experienced in the telecom debate, such as Representative Boucher, leave the Congress, and we have so many new freshmen. How is each of your associations going about educating the new members or new members on committees that might be less experienced on this?
Well, we look forward to meeting with the new members, talking about the importance of broadband, what our industry is doing, the level of investment, and the importance of a positive regulatory climate to continue to incent that investment. We really are benefited by the FCC's National Broadband Plan, which I think people look at as they should, as an impartial, data-driven kind of document. And it really details the extraordinary level of competition, the extraordinary investment that has occurred. It also, I think, identifies the right issues that need to be addressed going forward. So, yeah, we will be meeting with members and staff over the course of the next several weeks, and that's what we really do through our lobbying.
So we probably have a few more concerns about the National Broadband Plan from NTCA's perspective. We're pleased to see the FCC, I think, kind of working through some of the things that were initially put out in that document. So when we're working with these new members of Congress, we probably are quicker to point out some of the issues that are concerning to us, particularly regarding universal service. Although I will tell you, people kind of say, well, do you not want anything to happen? We're the first who think that reform actually does need to take place with USF. The world has changed far too much since the '96 Act. But in terms of working with Congress, we do have a huge grassroots. We've got folks in all of these communities, and what we really need is we really need our carriers who are out in these areas with these 100 freshman members of Congress to be talking about what their specific challenges are. If you're out in Montana, you're out in North Dakota, you're out in Alabama, you've got very different needs and very different service territories. So we will be deploying our folks. Our members are terrific about creating relationships and educating members of Congress, so they are starting that process right now. We also will have about 600 folks coming to Washington in March to do grassroots lobbying, which we think is a really, a key point, because again, we can talk about it at the national level. What these members of Congress need to hear is how it impacts folks back home, what kind of services can be provided, what does it mean for their constituents. And then really just kind of focusing as you look at the new lay of the land. And yes, Rick Boucher is a big loss, I think, to the telecom debate. Regardless of whether you agreed with him or disagreed with him, he was a member of Congress who was very smart and really understood the details of what he was doing. So you kind of look at the lay of the land with the Senate and the House and kind of think about who's willing to kind of roll up their sleeves and which members out there are kind of looking to take a leadership role on some of these issues. And that's something that we'll be doing.
We're going to be much the same, encouraging our members as well as ourselves. We're already up on the Hill trying to meet with the new members. The one thing that's really interesting about the new members, a lot of them have a business background. And that's really beneficial because the largest majority of our members are small, medium-sized businesses. And to relate to the congressman who understands what it means to make a payroll, to put your capital at risk, to have investors call you every time there's headlines in the Wall Street Journal that might affect them on the business and saying, hey, does that affect you? What is the meaning of this? Our guys are used to that. And so that's going to be our story. Competition is what's brought innovation, both in pricing, as well as technology and applications in this industry. And it needs to be protected and promoted, and that's what we're going to be saying. Also, we need stability as always in this industry, because that's how you get capital, is people thinking that there's a horizon for a business model to be successful. And so we're looking forward to working with the FCC as well on special access and a number of these issues. Up on the Hill, our messages will be the same. Last mile access has to be protected and guaranteed. We want to see some reforms and compensation issues such as USF reform and intercarrier comp. And we also want to see interconnection available to all competitors. And that's pretty much our message. We got here because regulatory was involved, rate of return, monopoly was guaranteed. Now we have competition. We need to see that competition continues to thrive. And we think that that message will bear a lot of fruit with this new Congress.
So we have all those issues, and we have a merger going on at Quest, kind of unique to us, but sometime in the first half of this year, we'll be merging with CenturyLink, and we'll be covering in our local service territory 37 states, as well as our national network covering all 50 states. So we have that transaction to talk to new members about, just so they're familiar with it, and also familiar with the benefits that the merger will bring as well. One aspect that we'll be bringing, when we talk about broadband, is bringing IPTV to many markets in our service territory. And this is a service that Quest has hoped to have provided, and now with the merger with CenturyLink, we'll be able to do that in bringing a video product to our customers. I think, too, there's also unique issues that we have at Quest because we serve such a rural territory. I mean, we're a network carrier, and we do serve the entire country, but we serve a lot of rural areas from the Great Plains to the Rockies to the southwestern part of the United States. It's all areas that are very hard to serve. And so, we like to talk to them about what can Congress do to kind of help with these underserved and unserved areas. It was addressed some last year in the broadband stimulus plan. What other things can Congress do to help us serve as many customers as we can in our service area? Plus, we have some very unique issues as well that we would like to get Congress to address. And Congressman Boucher did that in the last Congress. I mean, one of those is traffic pumping. It's just an issue that continues, and it's something that needs to be addressed, and we hope that this Congress will do some of that.
Well, before we get into too specific of issues, I just want to ask one more kind of follow-up to my last question, and anyone can answer this. How long do you think it will take this Congress to become comfortable enough with these issues to actually move forward on a Telecom Act rewrite or any of the issues you mentioned?
I personally don't think it's going to take very long. I mean, particularly with regard to the House of Representatives, I would agree with Shirley that it's just absolutely essential that the FCC and/or the Congress deal with intercarrier compensation. I mean, you cannot operate networks successfully if people aren't paying for the use of the network. But we have in the new House Communications Subcommittee Chairman, Greg Walden, a guy who really understands what it's going to take to get broadband to rural areas. He's hired Ray Baum, who is the only individual in the United States who's ever achieved a global consensus on intercarrier compensation reform. And in the Senate, there hadn't been much shuffling. So I don't think it's going to take very long for Congress to begin to maybe hit some solid singles with regard to updating elements of the 96 Act.
I'm more inclined to still stick with, I think the next 2 years are a ramp up. I think it's still, you've got the switch in leadership in the House. I think, again, it's just a question of how much bandwidth healthcare, particularly because the House folks, have that jurisdiction as well. I still see the next couple of years, although, in our world, 2 years is a really, really long time. I mean, you were talking about the 2006 effort. It was like, that's a different lifetime ago in terms of changes in technology and the regulatory environment. But I still, we'll see if in 6 months we can get some consensus regarding healthcare. Then I think there's a little bit more room for discussion.
I think there's some specific issues that already have some momentum, more to investigate and to understand, and we'll see more of that. I think we'll see oversight hearings to build a relationship in whatever form with the FCC and monitor what they're doing. But I do think the Congress as a whole, at least the House, has chosen to deal with health care budget, some big elephant items, and that's going to consume some of the oxygen for a while. But I think our issues will consider to be important and will be looked into. But as far as action, who can predict?
Yeah, I agree with all that. I mean, I think the next 2 years will go by actually pretty fast. It's a long time for sure, but you have this year where there's going to be a lot of focus on healthcare. In the committee, maybe looking at net neutrality and, of course, oversight. But next year you have an election, and it's a presidential election year, and so Congress is not going to be in Washington quite as much. They're all running for re-election. They're helping their party get a president elected. So I think time will go by very fast, and I think you'll find that there just won't be enough time to address all the issues, really, that we'd like to see addressed.
I think another factor, too, we're still coming out of this slow economy, and anything of legislative nature that would be disruptive, that people have to realign or readjust or do something that would adversely affect or possibly just impact their business models would be something they would be concerned about. Capital is just barely flowing back into the market. And so I think they want to see that recovery continue, and that's going to be another, they're going to have an eye on the economy before, as well as any legislative activity they intend to proceed with.
I also think that we're going to see, you know, if there's some things that are hanging out there from the Comcast court case that pop up, you know, what the FCC chooses to do with NBC Comcast. I mean, there will be some pieces that I think will be popping up that, you know, could also be drivers depending on kind of some of those outcomes.
Great. Well, at this point, does anybody in the audience have any questions? Yep, please.
Yes, unless I missed it, we're still waiting to find out who the House ranking member will be on the telecommunications subcommittee, and I wonder if anybody has any predictions of who that might be.
Oh.
Feeling brave this morning, aren't we?
I'm going with the Jets, maybe. But oh, wrong prediction.
I think it's safe to say none of us have any real insight.
Thank you, Walter.
Well, I guess a related question to that is some people have, people are saying that the front runners are Representative Rush and Representative Eshoo. Just look from a personality point of view, how would they, or are there certain issues one might focus over another, or you know, and how would their personalities affect how they look at some of these issues? So, anyone want to? Yeah.
You know, the one thing I will say, and we, you know, obviously, rural Chicago does not fall in our demographics, but I would say that, you know, they both have been very engaged members of the committee. They both have been, you know, very astute. They both have great track records when it comes to actually showing up and being present and being engaged in the committee. So I think both of them will be able to step into the role if either one of them gets it. You know, I look at the Congresswoman, you know, serves the Silicon Valley area. I mean, she's got that high-tech kind of presence in her background. So I think that if she takes over, you will definitely see an emphasis. And Jerry was kind of talking about, you know, network providers versus applications. You know, I think she's got, you know, a lot of relationships with folks in kind of the application high-tech arena. I think it'll just create a different focus. But at the end of the day, I think, you know, the chairman does not drive so much the agenda as the full committee and the whole committee working together, and, you know, what are going to be the pressing issues. So I don't think you're going to see personal agendas really coming out legislatively.
Okay. Would anyone like to ask an easier question?
If there are any easy questions, I'm willing to take them.
Hi all, this is Ted Gotch with Telecommunications Reports. As we know, this last election got rather heated. And even though obviously the last few weeks, due to the events in Arizona, there sort of has been talk of a cooling down. And also, even though telecom has always sort of put itself above, say, oh, it's a bipartisan issue, it doesn't, you know, we're not really affected that much by who is in charge of the House. Is there any sense that, though, the backlash, if you will, due to the friction between the two parties, could have an effect in getting things done in the telecom realm that maybe the industry hasn't faced that before due to the bipartisan nature of the topic?
Well, I will say that in the industry, we're concerned about the way issues have begun to break down sometimes on partisan basis. Historically, telecommunications and technology issues have not been partisan. So that they really have been driven by empirical analyses and a common understanding of objectives such as broadband deployment, broadband adoption. And the members of the respective parties have been able to work together. We did see some good bipartisan work last year on USF with Congressman Boucher and Congressman Terry. So I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful that we will see more bipartisanship on these issues and a real focus on on trying to work together.
I'd agree on that. Mostly our issues are nonpartisan because they cover, they cross the board the economy, the ecosystem of our economy. And everyone understands the need for the most advanced communications possible. We compete not only in the United States, but globally. And so it's a big factor, our telecommunications services are to individual customers as well as enterprise providers. So I think they'll rise above that and consider our issues on the merits.
Sort of a related question to that. The major difference this year is we have a split Congress. Does that affect the chances of getting any of these items done, either in terms of preventing them from getting done, or even possibly raising the priority, since, as you said, they are more bipartisan issues?
I still go with, I think in general, the issues do not tend to be, some of the big ones out there do not tend to be partisan. So I think there is, so much of it as we've seen, and it goes across every sector that we all work in. If the chairman's reaching out, working with each other, coming up with some common goals, I think that again, you take something like USF. Universal services is very important to a lot of members of Congress. You look at the Senate. The Senate, in general, is a pretty rural body. All of them have rural areas. If Senator Rockefeller, now I think is really focused on West Virginia. How do you get broadband out in West Virginia? For him to reach across the aisle. You've got Chairman Upton, who also has rural areas of Michigan. I think if they are able to develop personal relationships and reach across and kind of, on some of these issues that can be done. Some of the other issues, there are going to be some issues that are a little bit more polarizing in general. I think privacy is one of those examples where people are just philosophically going to come at it from a different perspective. But I definitely think there's a number of issues that I don't see the split Congress necessarily. As a matter of fact, sometimes people behave a little bit more collegial in a split Congress because it is kind of that, how do we work together to get something accomplished, as opposed to how do we cram our agenda through. So, I remain hopeful.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, there have been times when, both houses of Congress have been controlled by, either the parties, and there's been trouble getting legislation through. I mean, this has historically been a challenge. But I think you're right. I think that, members are looking to reach, looking beyond partisanship and that sort of thing. But again, we're going to have such an accelerated agenda this Congress with so many issues there. I think that's going to be the challenge really for us, is what can we get to the full committee level and then to the full House or the full Senate to be considered. There's just so many things that are going to be on the agenda this Congress. That's going to be the real challenge.
And there were conversations last year between the Senate and House Commerce committees about updating the Act. Do you see those talks as being revived? I mean, obviously we have a new chairman of the House Commerce Committee.
We're going to encourage that those talks continue. So.
Any other questions from the audience at this point? Yeah. All right.
That hard Question, you're all afraid now?
I guess just related to that last question. Have you heard anything to indicate that Chairman Upton and Chairman Weldon, are as interested as Chairman Boucher was last year in rewriting the act?
I think they're still getting their kind of pieces in place. So I think they've been wise about kind of taking their own counsel at this point. So I have not picked up anything, but I will say you do look at some members of the Commerce Committees. I look at, for example, somebody like Senator Begich from Alaska. I think Senator Begich, you look at some of these kind of really folks on these committees who are relatively new, who are ready to roll up their sleeves and kind of get into the issues. And I know he, for one, is very interested in taking a real leadership role on things like USF. And it makes sense. You look at Alaska, you look at the remoteness. So I think in some ways, some of these are going to be driven by some of these different members that have some of their interests that they want to tee up. But I think, until, we just got the announcement about the committee organization, so I still think it's a little soon for some of them to be putting some of their agendas too far out there.
So I'm thinking about what the Commerce Committee hasn't really focused on directly. If you think about the stock market, people are not, with all due respect to your companies, they're focusing on companies like Netflix, Google, Microsoft, Facebook when it comes out publicly, possibly Microsoft. These are not companies that have historically been regulated companies, and yet they are at the centerpiece of U.S. communications today. So the question I'd ask is, does Congress need to rethink its organization? You have two committees of jurisdiction that kind of both cover this. Maybe there are more, but I'm thinking of Judiciary and Commerce. But these are the companies, in the run-up to the 96 and past the 96 Act, Jerry's companies were high flyers in the stock market. There's enormous interest by investors in CLEX. And it just seems to me that maybe discussing the rewrite of the 1996 Telecom Act is kind of missing the fact that the ball has moved to another sphere, relatively unregulated, a strong desire to remain unregulated, and yet that's where much of the stock market and consumer interest is.
Yeah, let me, hopefully this is responsive to what you're asking, Dan, but in Washington, we tend to talk about, well, will they update the 96 Act? That's not the way these issues come to members of Congress. The way the issues come to members of Congress is somebody comes in and says, my privacy is being violated. Or somebody comes in and they say, you know what, I really am concerned about the fact that I've got a small business and I'm trying to advertise on a search engine and I just don't have the scale that Borders has. And what can I do to get a fair shake? People come to Congress with problems, with real life problems, and then Congress holds hearings on those real life problems. In our industry, one of the real life problems we have is that people are utilizing the network to transmit voice telecommunications and are not paying anything for the use of the network. That's a real problem. I mean, we've gone to the Congress, we're going to the Congress, going to the FCC, and we're saying, you can't operate a business that nobody's paying for. And so it's then the Congress that says, all right, well, that will require us then to go into and update the 96 Act. Similarly, as you said, it's not necessarily that people who have a problem just naturally gravitate towards members of the Commerce Committee. You know, they'll gravitate towards their nearest congressman, and a buzz develops inside the Congress. I do think that it is more likely than not that the Senate and House Commerce Committees will probably be the lead committees with regard to policy in this area because they have about the broadest jurisdiction of any committees in the Congress. It's basically whatever moves under the Commerce Clause of the United States. And they have jurisdiction over both the Federal Communications Commission and the Federal Trade Commission. which historically have been the two agencies that really have been involved in protecting competition in the marketplace and dealing with communications policy. So I don't think that the Congress is going to need to reorganize. And I also don't think that these necessarily just all of a sudden bubble up with people holding hearings on shall we revamp the 96 Act. But I do think that you're going to start seeing a series of focused hearings on problems that naturally fall within the jurisdictions of those committees and under the purview, arguably, of those two agencies.
Just to clarify one point from Walter, our members pay a lot of money to incumbents. So I'm not sure, I don't want to say all people ride free, because that's certainly, if not, we need to quit sending checks.
Oh, no, you don't.
But I do agree that problems come to Congress because people feel there's a crisis. I think with privacy, the reason why there's a lot of interest in privacy is because there is this issue of where's my information, who has it, what are they doing with it. Cybersecurity is because we've seen the leaks everybody's read about, and people want to know where's the information, how is it being protected. So I do think this Congress is going to try to deal with those specific things. And the ecosystem of the internet is unique. There are all kinds of business models out there. And before legislation is written, you have to understand that what impact you're going to have if you change the rules of the road. And I think they're proceeding cautiously because of that.
And I think you do raise a really interesting point. I mean, there is kind of this dichotomy between, kind of the backbone in the network and then the application piece. And frankly, the network is not that sexy. The applications and the providers that ride on that are a lot more interesting and can be perceived as being a lot more innovative. It's kind of recognizing, the symbiotic nature of, you need the network to ride the applications. Just as, I still marvel at the number of people I still have to explain that your wireless phones don't really work unless you've got kind of a fiber connection or, something to a backhaul. And I find every new Congress you get these young staff people that you're explaining how it really doesn't ride from phone to phone. And so it is kind of that, how do you meld those two relationships together that, they're really mutually beneficial, but it is, you raise an interesting point politically. I think that's going to be really interesting.
Yeah, I think so too, and I agree with Walter. From working on the Hill, I know if an issue came from a constituent about a certain issue, a lot of times we would direct it to the right committee. It's interesting you bring up about whether we need to take a look at the committee structure, but actually we deal with a lot of committees. And some of the issues we talked about today, we talked about cybersecurity, we deal with government oversight on cybersecurity issues. We deal with our federal services and the services that we sell to the government. We also deal with the Government Oversight Committee. We talked about rural broadband and underserved and unserved areas. We've talked to the Agriculture Committee about that. And of course, there's always issues that we're talking to the Appropriations Committee about. So there is a lot of committees in Congress that we are dealing with. All of them have a little piece of communications, but as Gary, as you talked about, communications now is just a big part of our economy. And I think that's what the interest of Congress is what can we do right now to improve the economy, to provide more jobs for the United States, and what can we do just to compete on a worldwide basis.
A few of you mentioned privacy as a likely priority for this Congress. What do you see as what are the next steps in that process? Where did they leave off last year, and how's that going to move forward?
Well, the last hearing dealt with whether you should opt in or opt out with regards to your information. I think the net neutrality rules, require carriers to be clear and forthright in their disclaimers to their consumers, to their customers, as to how their network is working and operating. And I think you're going to see more and more clarity into those kinds of things and more investigation as to what information is being tracked and for what purpose. Many of these things are for network and some are not. They're for marketing or advertising or other things. Our members are not much in the content, they're the network providers. And so I think there's kind of two levels of questions.
And is that an issue where there pretty much is bipartisan consensus, or does the change in the House from Democrats to Republicans perhaps change the direction of that conversation?
I think that there's bipartisan concern about the problem. I don't know that there is yet any consensus, partisan or bipartisan, with regard to the solution. But I think that the concern is bipartisan.
Hi, Jonathan Charnitskin with Broadband Breakfast. How much flexibility will there be on these more contentious issues like net neutrality in the name of getting something done? I know that at least 3 of the 5 commissioners have told me that they would like to see a rewrite of the act. Things are not getting done and they're wasting time based on not knowing what mandate they have. So how much flexibility will there be for something to come out of Congress so that they know what's going on?
Again, I hope this is responsive to the question. The chairman of the FCC indicated that his authority wasn't clear and expressed frustration over that. As you articulate, others are frustrated. 300 members of the United States Congress said, Congress needs to define policy with regard to the internet. So I think that there is developing a consensus on a bipartisan basis that the law is unclear and that this creates challenges for the agency. And because it creates these challenges for the agency is not in a position to afford consumers with a common expectation across the internet ecosystem as to what they have a right to expect. The agency's tried to deal with this, for example, with regard to voice telephony. And, consumer has an expectation when they have a voice provider that they'll be able to dial 911. Well, when over the top came along, that wasn't necessarily the case. The Commission has now issued a series of rules with regard to what consumers have a right to expect in terms of the practices of network providers. But those same expectations are nowhere required with regard to services and applications providers that may be offering functionally equivalent services to the consumer. So these are clearly challenging issues, and I think that they are ones that can only ultimately be resolved by the Congress.
With the recent net neutrality order, Congress has said they are going to probably spend the next couple months trying to reverse that. How much energy does that take up for the committee, and does it stall work on other matters?
My take is it sucks up a lot of energy. I mean, I just think that's, we talk, you kind of raised and we kind of talked here about, how do you find some consensus and are there some bipartisan issues and how well will people work together? I think the downside of that coming out of the box is that just tees up right away that, it potentially bogs it down more than I think the committees need to be at this point. But I think, it depends on what path they take. If they choose to do kind of a complete, focus on net neutrality, or to Walter's point, do you deal with the areas where there's clarity needed? Do if you're responsive to the Democratic FCC and say, what does the chairman of the FCC need to be able to move forward, that becomes a different approach. So I think it depends on whether they kind of go for a full outright revamp, or whether they basically go, okay, there's some clarification that we as Congress need to provide, and this is what it is. So I think it just depends on what path they choose.
I think we wait and see what they decide to do about net neutrality. I think one of the issues that was brought up during the whole lead up to the December order is whether or not they have the broadband authority for USF reform. And I think that question still hangs out there to understand whether or not they have that authority or not, and how they would go about either covering it through agency action or whether that'll take congressional action, because we all agree the USF needs to be reformed, and the question begins at how is that going to move forward?
Well, that does bring up another question. Is it more likely at this point that we'll see USF reform in the Congress or at the FCC? Or is there one your associations would prefer?
Well, I think we're going to see, you know, the FCC has been moving forward on these pieces, and I think we're going to see an NPRM pretty soon that will likely deal with USF and inter-carrier comp, which is good. I mean, these issues need to be dealt with, and they've got to be dealt with together. I mean, in a lot of ways, until you deal with inter-carrier comp, you really don't even know kind of how to size USF and what you're trying to deal with. So it is important they move forward. I think that we're going to see something coming out from the FCC in short order. So I think that will help set the stage, because if they come out with something, you know, in the next month or two, I think they'll get out ahead of what Congress would be able to put on the table. So that will certainly probably be the lead on the discussion, and that follows on what, you know, the pieces you've seen in the National Broadband Plan. So whether, you know, who really has ultimate end-run authority, or, you know, will the FCC move, and then if we've got issues, we'll certainly be going to Congress, and my guess would be everybody else up here would do the same. But, you know, again, I think that FCC has the first ball right now.
Does the loss of Rick Boucher kind of change the enthusiasm Congress might have for USF reform, or do you think you know, it will still be there?
We're going to try and make them enthusiastic.
Yeah. Fortunately, I think Lee Terry's pretty enthusiastic about USF reform, and so I think, you know, he's you know, as a member of the committee, will also be pushing for USF reform.
And you look at, you know, Chairman Rockefeller, you look at his Senate Commerce Committee staff, he's got some incredibly knowledgeable people there as well, you know, who really understand. I mean, USF is really complicated, so you've got some people there on his staff who understand it. I think Chairman Weldon, bring Ray Baum in. You know, Ray has been doing this stuff with the Joint Board and, you know, as a state commissioner. I mean, you've really got some people who actually can kind of dig their way through this. So I think that actually speaks really well as well for Congress getting a handle on this.
Mm-hmm. And there had been some talk that Chairman Rockefeller, his position is let the FCC go ahead. You know, they should have done it yesterday, that kind of thing. Is that still the case, or do you think he'd be open to some kind of legislation on that topic?
I think we'll see what the FCC comes out with. You know, but it's a unique state in that, you know, you've got Frontier now handling a lot of the state. We have some carriers in the state. It's a tough terrain to serve. He's chairman of the Senate Commerce Committee. I think he'd like to see broader broadband deployment deployed in the state. So it'll be a question of whether, you know, how all of those cards kind of line up in terms of how engaged I think he'll be in that.
Any other questions at this time? No? Okay. Let me go back to the stage. Well, the National Broadband set up several recommendations, and, you know, a few of them require congressional authorization. For example, voluntary incentive auctions, you know, public safety, and perhaps some on USF. Do you see these as being early priorities for Congress?
Well, there's a lot that's been written on the auctions. I think the chairman of the FCC has talked about the importance of spectrum to broadband deployment. So yeah, I think that there will be a high degree of interest in the spectrum issues. I hope that with regard to the National Broadband Plan, that the principal focus on deployment and adoption would sort of drive everything in this area. You know, with regard to deployment, the central issue is to make sure that the financial fundamentals are addressed. The key initiative is to make sure that you have reform of inter-carrier compensation in USF in a way that stabilizes the financial fundamentals for the future. So I would hope that that would be, you know, a very, very, very high priority. And we do think that those objectives, you know, increased deployment, increased investment in facilities-based competition, and increased adoption, and a focus on adoption, that those are the critical aspects of national broadband policy.
We agree they've got to deal with the pocketbook issues. We hopefully look for some reform in special access. We look for reform in USF and intercarrier comp. I think the commission has to move forward, and hopefully they'll be very aggressive in 2011. I think the Congress will respond whenever they see there's a need from their position that there needs to be fine-tuning or further input. And so I think if the FCC leads forward, it's behind on its schedule, but hopefully they'll start to catch up and we'll see some activity, and that will generate other activity, as it always does.
Yeah, I think with regard to the auctions, I think that industry is looking for some solution there. So I think that's going to be something that will have to be considered soon. Also, the public service aspect of the spectrum is something that needs to be addressed. And I think that there'll be a lot of pressure on the Congress to weigh in on that. And I think everyone signing on the panel today seems like getting some certainty in USF and intercarrier comp is something that everyone's really looking for and hopes that the Congress will bring up soon.
Some have said they expect oversight to be a major emphasis for this Congress. Would you agree that we're likely to see a lot of that, especially given the broadband stimulus money that went out last year, and I guess we'll start seeing results coming in on that?
Absolutely.
Do you expect the?
I think the NTIA and RUS will be doing their jobs, hopefully, to ensure compliance. And we for one, appreciate the open network access requirement. And so our members are very interested in where these network facilities are being deployed under this program because it offers them new opportunities for wholesale providers to access network elements. And so I think Congress will be watchful of all aspects of government where the money's gone, given the budget constraints and the spending. And so I think it's going to be high on everybody's list.
And the only thing I would say is that we're hoping that there's a consistent message from government. That, you know, on one hand, you've got all these stimulus dollars that have gone out the door, both, you know, middle mile and to the end user projects, broadband adoption projects, you know, and then as they work their way through USF reform, you know, it'll be important for us who serve in these small, you know, these rural high-cost areas, that you're getting the same message, that there's incentives, you know, on the regulatory compensation piece, as well as the additional federal dollars that have gone out there, that the two philosophies kind of meld together. To Walter's point, you know, broadband deployment is really important, and it's really hard to get to those last customers that you've got. So how do you deal with those underserved and unserved? And we totally agree. Adoption issues are huge. I mean, we're seeing in our marketplaces that our folks are now up to about a 55% take rate, which is about a 6% jump over last year, but that's 55%. So that's, if you've already built it, 55% of your customers are taking it. You know, for us, and it kind of goes to the pocketbook again, the more you can kind of get folks on there, the better cost proposition it is for your entire service area. 55% is great, just because it's an increase, but it's nowhere near where we need to be. So I think, you know, when you look at a topic that Congress can, in a bipartisan way, find some agreement on, I would hope that adoption would be right up there.
Okay. We talked a little bit about committee jurisdiction. Do you expect the oversight committees to be the oversight committee in the House to get more involved on telecom issues in this Congress?
Well, I think that Chairman Issa has indicated that he wants to. So, you know, I guess we will wait and see. But by his own words, he's indicated that he would like to do that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I've heard that too. I think he's particularly interested in the federal contracting issues when it comes to telecommunication services, and that's something that the committee will be looking into, I think, this Congress.
Great. Great.
Just really quickly, a California court last week, I believe it was, ruled that USF funds that went to, don't quote me on this, I think it was AT&T, were to be deemed regular income. Does that affect any issues upcoming for USF reform, and does it affect plans for deployment of broadband services using USF funds?
You know, I've seen the court case, but I'll be honest with you, I haven't really looked into it. I think anytime, you know, USF is kind of out there, you've got to take a look. You know, it all goes into kind of the big USF pot. I will tell you from our perspective is USF is critical. I mean, our folks, Jerry was talking about competition earlier. My guys, don't have enough to competition. They're not market-based enough to be able to survive and actually deploy to a lot of their remote parts of their service territory without some kind of a support mechanism. And so, we're just going to kind of have to see how all of those pieces fit into the mix and come out. But at this point, I don't think, we've been talking to the FCC. I think they've really got kind of a vision for where they want to go with USF and kind of how that fits in. I think Congress is very sensitized to the role that USF plays. How do you deal with things like, multiple ETCs and identical support rule and a lot of those other things that can be done with universal service to do a lot of streamlining is going to be really important.
For us, it's important that we cap the pool. It's up to about $9 billion, 15% surcharge on bills. Second, we think it needs to be reformed because there needs to be significant accountability relative to the funds, and we want it to be competitively neutral so that it doesn't adversely affect a competitor in a marketplace. And so there's a lot of reforms and a lot of issues here as to, A, who pays in. We'd like to see a broader number of folks paying in to reduce it overall and to be more targeted. So there's a lot of challenges facing both the FCC and the Congress, if it chooses to weigh in, relative to how to fix some of these complex issues. But it is long since needed, and it's like some of our other issues. Special access has been waiting for 7 years and so on. So we're ready for the FCC to move forward, and if Congress was to weigh in, hopefully they'll use the information that's been gathered by the FCC, which is their role, in deciding or analyzing the issues.
Last year we saw the major healthcare bill and financial reform bills have some implications for telecom carriers. Are there, this year, any major efforts like that you're expecting might have some implications to your businesses that we should be watching?
We haven't focused on any particular ones as yet. Clearly, last year, the financial reform bill did have implications. We were able to work that out so that it was not in any way punitive or disadvantageous to our members. But until the President hasn't given his State of the Union yet, and so until we kind of know what the agenda is, it's difficult for us to sort of calculate what the impact of that agenda may be on our industry.
Well, just as a reminder, our members are small, medium-sized businesses predominantly is our membership. So any large legislation or cost impacts as employers, that obviously our members have to look at and evaluate how to implement health care or whatever the issues are, taxes, anything. Our folks are not just only interested in telecom, they're interested in all the other business-related issues that Congress decides to weigh in on and make changes.
All right, last chance for questions. Anyone? Well, then I guess we could probably wrap up now. It's been a great panel. Thanks so much for taking the time, everyone, for coming out.
Thank you.
Thanks again for coming, and thank you, panelists and moderator. Thanks. And just wanted to point out on the back of your program our upcoming events, in particular our upcoming Broadband Breakfast Club on February 15th, Competition in the Wireless Environment, How to Get More Handsets and More Networks. And please join me again in thanking our sponsors of the Broadband Breakfast Club, the National Cable and Telecommunications Association, NCTA, Telecommunications Industry of America, TIA, and United States Telecom Association, US Telecom. And don't forget to fill out your surveys, please. Thanks.